An Endless Dawn, written by Avril Sabine. Dedication. For those friends who, no matter how much time has passed, it only seems like minutes since we were last together. Book description. The beginning of a new dawn. When an alien life form is discovered and brought back to Earth, the possibilities seem endless. Piper is fascinated from the beginning, wanting to know everything about the plant, and desperate to own one, when a limited amount are released to the public. There are of course the usual rumors and crazy people who preach that the end of the world is coming. But Piper knows better. It's the most monumental discovery, and somehow she'll become part of it. Chapter 1. Piper scrolled down the page of her online private journal. She paused to reread some of the news headlines she knew off by heart. A new dawn for man. Could this be the first step in proving the existence of aliens? Experiments begun on Dawn in sterile environment. Dawn laboratory sabotaged. Discovery of the century, will pollution be a fear of the past? She stared longer at her two favorite headlines. Propagation of Dawn proven successful. Seedlings available for the public to purchase soon. She remembered the moment she'd first read them and the thrill that had raced through her. Now she had a new favorite headline. Reaching the bottom of the page, she pasted in the latest article. She stared at the image of the vividly green plant, with its dainty leaves. Her gaze was drawn to the headline above the image. Dawn available in selected shops tomorrow. Her heart leapt again as she reread the words. She'd been waiting for this moment for what felt like forever. Now, if only she could convince her parents to lend her the money. She'd been saving ever since she'd learned it was going to be possible to buy a plant. It was a pity they were so expensive, but she guessed it was to be expected, since stock was limited and being sold worldwide. She didn't have $2,000 for a seedling. Somehow she had to make her parents understand how important this was to her. Her gaze was drawn to her bedroom door, but she remained seated at her desk. They were probably in the living room, watching the news. She doubted they'd spend that much money on her, but what else could she do? This was important. She had to make them understand. She tried to think of ways to approach them, going so far as to whisper a few sentences. Nothing sounded right. All she could do was try. Rising from her desk, she strode to her bedroom door. She paused, a smile starting to form. Maybe she could remind them it was discovered by someone from their country. The astronaut might have been born in China, but he'd moved to Australia as a child, so that made it an Australian discovery. They could argue back and forth on the news about which country the discovery belonged to, but it was here in Australia, even though most of the companies now involved were foreign. She headed for the living room, trying to think of more reasons why they had to buy her a plant. Her parents, Alistair and Tricia, were seated together watching the news that was displayed on the far wall of their small living room. They both had ordinary brown hair that they'd passed along to her. Alistair's hair was thinning while Tricia's fell around her shoulders, almost as long as her own. They looked up at her where she stood in the doorway, and she met her mum's blue eyes first before shifting her gaze to meet her dad's green eyes, identical to hers. "Is something wrong?" Alistair asked. She shook her head, settling on a plan. Well, something of a plan. She'd ease into the topic and remind them of how much it meant to her. Remind them that it would be almost unpatriotic not to be involved. "Have you seen the news? About Dawn?" "It'd be a little hard to miss," Alistair said dryly. "I've heard it constantly for the past couple of hours," Tricia said. "It's on every station. Surely there's more important news." Obviously her plan wasn't going exactly the way she'd expected. "Don't you think it's awesome?" "What would be more awesome was if we didn't have to hear about Dawn half a dozen times a day," Tricia said. Alistair chuckled. "And not only from the news. He shared a look with Trisha, who smiled at him. Piper's heart sank. Didn't they understand how important this was? It's the greatest moment since man walked on the moon, and our country was the one that discovered Dawn. I doubt anyone alive remembers that space event. I'm sure some people are alive, Trisha said. Babies don't count. They wouldn't have been old enough to realize how important walking on the moon was. There've been other great events, Alastair said. Piper shook her head. Not this amazing and not space-related. What about the Mars colonization project? Trisha asked. That doesn't count. It was a failure. Dawn would have changed all that. She would have made the environment more suitable, so the project wouldn't have failed. She'd heard there were plans to take Dawn on the next Mars mission. There'd been nothing in the news, only rumors. She knew, because she'd been scouring the news sites ever since she'd heard the rumor. Is there a reason you're telling us something we already know? Trisha asked. It looked like easing into it wasn't going to work. I really need one. This is the most monumental thing that will ever happen in my lifetime, and I want to be a part of it. She needed to be a part of it. And it'd be unpatriotic not to be. Alastair shook his head. We can't afford $2,000. You'll have to wait until prices come down. I'm sure they will, particularly since the plant grows fast in polluted environments. You'll probably end up getting a cutting for free. She spoke quickly, not wanting to get him started on the topic of pollution. Then she'd never have a chance to convince them. That's too long a wait. I've got $307 I can put towards it. Mum, Dad. Please? She drew the last word out, mentally begging them as her gaze shifted from one to the other. You can plead all you want, it's not going to change facts. We can't afford it, Alastair said. But? Didn't you hear me? We can't afford it. There are too many bills to deal with at this time of year. Maybe by your 17th birthday we can buy you one. Her heart sank. That was ages away. 4 entire months. A third of a year. How was she meant to wait that long? Her shoulders slumped. I'm going next door. She didn't bother saying goodbye, as she headed for the door. How could they have said no? They should know how important this was to her. It was all she talked about since Dawn was discovered. Be back before dinner, Trisha called after her. She stepped into the corridor of the apartment building, letting the door close behind her. Why couldn't they understand? She devoured every bit of news about Dawn since the moment the plant had been discovered, and brought back to Earth in a glass container. Those first images were burned into her brain, and she could see them as clearly as if the images were currently in front of her. Which wasn't surprising with the amount of times she'd stared at them. Reaching the elevator, she addressed the control panel. Ground floor. While she waited for the elevator, she continued to think about the many images she'd seen. The next lot of photos the world had been shown was of the lab where testing had been carried out. An artificial environment of glass and stainless steel, filled with people in white coats. Her first glimpse of the small piece of plant being studied had caused excitement to race through her. It had immediately been followed by envy that she wasn't old enough to be one of the scientists privileged to work on the Dawn project. The elevator arrived and she entered, waiting for it to reach the ground floor. There had to be some way for her to get her own plant. Maybe she should have let her dad get started on his favorite rant. The plant thrived on pollution, cleaning toxins from the air, releasing oxygen back into it. Her dad had said often enough that people needed to do more about pollution. That if they kept going the way they were, there'd be no Earth left for future generations. He'd gone on about it so many times she'd long since stopped listening to him. But if being bored for a couple of hours was what it took to get her own plant, then maybe she should have let him ramble on about his numerous complaints over the state of the world. People had been predicting the destruction of the planet forever, and it obviously hadn't happened. The elevator door slid open and she stepped outside, crossing the foyer. Before she'd reached the exit, she sent a message to Celine, her best friend, with her communication device to tell her she was on the way over. A reply came back almost immediately. "We'll meet you out the front." She stared at the words for a moment. It had only been an hour since she'd seen Celine at school, so she shouldn't have any news she didn't want her mother to overhear. Which was the only reason Celine ever wanted to meet outside. Piper had nearly reached the front door of Celine's apartment building when her friend burst outside, hurrying towards her. She smiled in greeting, not bothering to walk any faster. The smile had been more than enough effort. All she could think about was how to get her own Dawn. There had to be a way. Over and over she came up with and discarded ridiculous ideas. The situation was hopeless, but the thought of giving up made her feel ill. She had to be a part of the first release of Dawn. Celine's black hair was pulled up in a short ponytail that bounced with her movements, her dark brown eyes gleaming with excitement. "I was about to send you a message when yours came through." "What about?" "That I was coming over to see you and could you meet me out here?" She really hoped Celine wasn't going to expect her to get excited about her news. She doubted she'd be able to manage. "Are you going to tell me, or do I need to drag every little detail out of you?" Celine grabbed hold of her hands, squeezing tightly as she shook them. "I'm getting one." Piper frowned. "Getting one what?" "A Dawn. Mum said it'd be my birthday and Christmas presents all in one, and I better not expect anything else this year. And I don't have to wait the 6 weeks until my birthday. I'm getting it tomorrow." Celine barely paused for breath. "Do you want to come with me?" "Go with you? Tomorrow?" A moment of jealousy struck, before it was replaced by excitement. She grinned. "You're so lucky. I'll ask my parents if I can go." She started to draw away from Celine, alternating between excitement and jealousy. She was thrilled for her friend, but she desperately wanted a plant of her own. Celine's grip tightened and she shook her head. "No. Tonight. Apparently people are already lining up at the shops. I'm supposed to go straight home once I've asked you. I need to help Mum organize everything. We're staying the entire night. Do you think you'll be able to come?"